Thank you, Alan. It's a pleasure to be here. I'd like to dedicate this lecture to the memory of a former colleague of yours, Professor Richard Manning. Richard was a friend and a scholar whom I greatly admired. In a profession where solemnity and dullness are grave occupational hazards, as some of you may know, Richard's playful imagination and sharp intellect were, the metaphor I've written here is like a whoopee cushion at a dull faculty meeting. A few weeks ago, I attended a conference for biologists, mathematicians, game theorists, and economists who were interested in evolutionary theory. It was a very interesting meeting, I thought. And at lunch one day, I overheard a conversation that went between an economist and a biologist that went kind of like this. The economist said to the biologist, "Are there any creationists left in respectable biology departments?" The biologist kind of sniffed. He said, "Not really. You know, there are 2 or 3 creationists who have a kind of traveling roadshow, and that's about it." And the economist said, "That's funny. Almost all of my colleagues in economics are creationists." And so I thought about that for a little bit and realized that there was something to what he said. I mean, what did he mean by saying that we're creationist economists? Well, I think the most direct interpretation would be simply that economists, the way we approach modeling human beings is almost entirely innocent of any evolutionary thinking. We simply do not think of human beings as the result of evolution, or we do not use, we may have one compartment of our mind that thinks of that, but in fact, when we come to doing economics, we don't. Now, normally, we economists don't credit either God or Adam Smith or even Paul Samuelson with creating Homo economicus. We just set down some postulates of rational behavior for Homo economicus to follow, and we turn him loose. Now, what postulates do we impose on him? Well, usually there are 2. One is that he is a very selfish fellow, and the other is that he's a very clever fellow. In fact, he's so clever that in any situation he encounters, he's able to determine the set of options available, calculate the one that maximizes his self-interest, and chooses that action. This is handy for economists because we can then simply apply the mathematics of constrained optimization and find theorems and so on with little, having almost made bricks without straw. Now, some people, particularly our colleagues in our sister sciences, occasionally ridicule us for having a Homo economicus who's such an abstraction. He's not a photograph of anybody. He's not even and certainly not a hologram. Just a very thinly drawn caricature. This criticism, I think, is wrong. I think that economists are on the right track of thinking about simplified models of a complex reality, trying to find something that is approximately right and seeing where it leads us, where the logic leads us. My quarrel with this approach is only that I don't think we've chosen the best possible caricature. I think maybe we should think for a moment or two about the 2 assumptions I've talked about. And, for example, the assumption that people are selfish, certainly you can see why we like that assumption. After all, it describes our colleagues so very well. But aside from that, if you think about if you were to have a first cut at what are people like, a model with selfish people in it, it's going to take you a long way in understanding the world. In fact, it'll take you a lot further than assuming, say, that people love their neighbor as themselves, or that they care about social justice above all things, and so on. So you can see that it's not a silly assumption in the sense of if you wanted something really simple for a first shot, try it, see where it goes, and I think that's right. On the other hand, we do see pretty convincing evidence that people do not always act selfishly. Hardly anyone would dispute that people are thoroughly selfish with respect to their children, even with respect to their neighbors. You'll certainly have seen even economists perform neighborly acts, I suspect. In fact, in experimental laboratories, we find even MBAs performing what appear to be acts of altruism, although perhaps acts of confusion. So we might at least want to explore to see if we can improve on the selfishness assumption. And this is one of the things I'm going to do in today's lecture, is to discuss from an evolutionary point of view what we might think about what evolutionary theory might suggest about how selfish people would be. In fact, let's see, before going much further, we can, let's even think about kind of a very, very rudimentary evolutionary notion about what altruism might be about. So the first thought would be, say, if you take a critter of, us or any other kind of critter, if he gives away his lunch to his neighbor, he's not very likely to proliferate his genes, is he? At least if he does this on a regular basis. On the other hand, if you consider the other extreme, consider a critter who's all wired up to eat his brothers and sisters. Okay. Well, you'd notice that in a sexual species, those genes wouldn't get passed along very well, would they? Because there'd be only one offspring per generation, and we'd soon see that line wiped out. Well, that's kind of a trivial example. Other things, in fact, actually, there are some lovely examples in nature of this kind of thing. There are the raptors, eagles, and things like that, where in many species they lay 2 eggs. First egg to hatch pushes the other egg out of the nest. There's an interesting story that goes with that. How can that work? Well, of course, it can only be sustained if the mother and father have more than one breeding season, right? Otherwise, but they indeed do. Why does mother lay 2 eggs? Well, because they don't always hatch, right? So 1 egg's insurance. She can really only raise 1 baby. She lays 2 eggs. 1 egg is insurance. If, in fact, 1 is already hatched. If only 1 hatches, then there's no point in pushing it out. You're better having laid 2. If 1 hatches, then the baby pushes the other one out. There's also a lovely example of a kind of spider where the babies eat their mother. Now, how can this work? Well, of course, mother lays a whole clutch of babies, right? So she's got a bunch of them in the first lot. They paralyze her and eat her up. Fortunately, even economist babies don't behave like that. But then economists don't hatch clutches of babies. They usually hatch just 1. I don't know if there's any evidence of an economist having twins or triplets. What would happen? Another example, if you've ever watched little pigs, you will notice that they don't try to assassinate their litter mates. They fight hard for their bit of nursing, but they don't kill each other, as you might have thought they might. And there's a little calculus that has to be thought about here. Well, we'll return to that kind of issue in a bit. Another bit of the story that I mentioned at the start was the assumption that people are supremely intelligent. Well, when economists are asked, why do you assume people are so damn smart? Our usual answer has been, well, what else would we assume about them? If they're dumb, how are they dumb? There's a zillion ways you can be dumb. There's only one way you can be clever, in some sense. And in fact, the question is, how would you model? How do you think about people with bounded rationality, bounded capacities? It's so much easier to conceive of an ideally platonically rational person and to figure out how he'd act. Well, perhaps, but it does seem to me that a very fruitful way of thinking about how smart are we likely to be is to think of us as the results of evolution, to think that we've evolved capabilities where they've been useful for our passing along, for our reproduction, and for our particular species, it's turned out to be useful to be, unless you go into university administration, it's turned out to be very useful to be intelligent. So, let's see. I made up, before going much further, I made up this little list of topics that I think are better understood if we look at them from an evolutionary point of view. And I'll set the list down and maybe make a few offensive remarks about each of them or about some of them. Let's see. So we just discussed, when we think about ourselves as imperfectly or as evolved creatures for whom doing clever things is sometimes useful, we also are inclined to start thinking about how do you economize on doing the right thing. Well, one way of doing the right thing, of course, may be to copy other critters who are performing successfully, right? We don't have to analyze what they were doing, but just copy them, okay? Another possibility is to learn things. You learn how to do something. You learn what has succeeded by trying stuff and do the things that worked out and eliminate the things that didn't work out. And of course, we may actually do the kind of insight and discovery occasionally by really solving the problem or thinking through things. So all of these things are things that clearly we do, and I think that an evolutionary approach to how well, first of all, it is useful, as economists are discovering, to think more carefully about learning models and imitation models and so on, as well as models of pure rationality or insight. Another set of topics that economists are almost entirely mute on are the emotions. When we talk about preferences, you like this rather than that, and we talk about risk aversion and so on. We may even talk about cold-blooded punishment in game theory, and we say, well, we tell this guy, if you step across that line, I will kick your butt, and we tell him that not because we would take pleasure in kicking his butt, but because we don't want him to cross the line. Okay. Well, when we think about the people that we meet or introspect about, we probably think, well, there are emotions that seem to be, in some sense, different from the rational utility maximizing choices that we make. There are things like love and hate and anger and fear and desire that in some sense are different from the calculations that we make. Why are we wired up to be that way? Well, some interesting work is starting to be done by economists about, I'm sure it has been done by other people, economists are starting to find some of this work about the emotions. An obvious thing to study, for example, in game theory, game theorists have become quite fascinated by problems where the problem of making a credible threat. Okay, so the problem is you tell your kid, look, if you misbehave, I'm going to spank you. And the kid, if he's a clever kid, future game theorist, will say, look, Papa doesn't want to spank me. I'll raise hell. He'll be mad. Mom will be mad at me. I'll just go ahead and do it. He won't do it. He won't pull it off. Well, so how does Papa make his threat credible? Well, of course, we could imagine that Papa realizes he's playing a long-term game with the kid, and that if he does it now, it'll scare the kid next time, and he won't have to spank as often. And that's partly right. But another thing he can do is just plain get mad. Just bugger the calculation. I'm mad at the little bugger. I'm going to swat him. Okay? And in fact, not that any of us would have behaved that way, but we read about people in the newspapers who occasionally get angry. Or if someone cheats you, it may be too expensive to punish him. You say, it isn't really worth my while to punish this person for having cheated me. And yet you may be furious and do it. Why does evolution not select out people that get mad, get furious, and do it? You see, it's a waste of your own resources. It's costly. Okay. Open question. We can concoct models in which there are selection models in which there are surviving punishers and haters and lovers and so on. And this is something that's not much done now, but I think is an interesting area for further work. An obvious area to think about from an evolutionary point of view is our reproductive urges. Even economists have them, I'm told. Perhaps it's rather curious. Economists, of course, simply have utility functions with which one of the arguments is the number of surviving children. But other people, we are told, have sexual desires, actually feel affection for children and like to see healthy children and things like that. So it's not too hard to imagine why. In fact, I suppose one of the strongest predictions of any evolutionary point of view is that any surviving kind of critter is going to be trying really hard to do things that proliferates its own type. And I think even economists are descended from a line of people who have successfully had sexual intercourse and raised children to adulthood for generation after generation after generation. So we can expect, in fact, that this area of behavior and of preferences is something where we're very likely to see some genetic hardwiring. And on theoretical grounds, we can expect that, and certainly casual empirical grounds suggest that there's a universality and a strength of these urges that you don't see with lots of other preferences. Another area where evolutionary theory certainly has much to say is in the differences between the sexes, differences and similarities for that matter. Why is that? Well, partly if we simply think about the cost structure of reproduction, what is the cost to a woman of having a baby? What's the cost to a man of fathering a baby? We think about that technology. We could guess, even if we hadn't read junk fiction, about the general predilections of males and females towards reproductive activity. We could guess that males are going to be more eager for quick impersonal sex, that females are going to be more interested in the resources a man brings to marriage or brings to raising the children. We can also guess some other things. In fact, it's one of the things you might suspect, I think, is a difference in attitudes towards risk between males and females. Why is that? Well, I would suggest that being, at least through most of the history of our species, being a relatively wealthy, high-status male is exceedingly valuable in terms of reproductive potential, okay? Because a wealthy, high-status male could have many mates, could have dozens and dozens of children. It would pay to bet your life on the difference between being a poor wimp who never could get a mate and a, king of the village. For females, such attitudes towards risk would be less appropriate. Female is, if she's fortunate, if she's fortunate, going to have a rather bounded number of offspring, even at best. Of course, it's going to be important to her to have sufficient food to be able to survive and raise healthy children. But to be fantastically wealthy is of no particular value, or of far less value than it would be to males. So one might expect a difference in attitudes towards risk. Another thing would be in the desires for status. Okay. In fact, one of the curious things I think about our economists' models of people's preferences is we care about what we consume. We don't care about what other guys are consuming. Now, when I watch my colleagues after they hear their salaries, or hear the salaries of people at other universities, or so on, what do? They're concerned about how they're doing relative to the other guys. Tremendously concerned about how they're doing relative to the other guys. When I watch people's consumption patterns, I see a tremendous amount of consumption of things that, at least to me, look simply like demonstrations of status, not of anything else. Why might we expect that kind of thing to happen? Well, one story, certainly not the only story, but an appealing one, I think, is that in our evolutionary history, particularly males with high relative status in the village were the ones who got the most mates. Okay. To some extent, it was important what your absolute status was, because you could help to feed your children. Okay. But it was very important to not only keep up with old Jones, but to get past him so you can mate with Mrs. Jones. Perhaps the property, in fact, what's going on there, if what people are fighting over is fixed in quantity, then it's the relatively rich who are going to get it. Okay, and if it's matings, the female population in the village is pretty much fixed. If everybody in the village gets wealthier, all the males get wealthier, it's not such a big deal for me as if I get wealthier and the other guys don't, because I get more matings. So the theory would go. Of course, there's some reason why I'd care about absolute wealth as well, because my children could be healthier if I had more wealth. Well, there are other things that I think, many other things you could think about from an evolutionary point of view. One on which some interesting work has been done is people's regard for the future. Why do I care? Why do I care about what's going to happen to the me of a year from now or the me of 5 years from now? How did it happen that we, as individuals, care about the future? What would we expect about the way that we would evaluate the future relative to the present? Should we, for example, should we be willing to trade even up for a unit of a glass of beer today for a glass of beer 5 years from now, or should we discount the future? Well, these are interesting things to think about if we entertained the hypothesis that our preferences about time choices were the result of selection for reproductive capacity. So, of course, it would be stupid not to care about future children. You say if you cared only about the present, you would be giving up the possibility, your genes would be giving up the possibility of making copies of themselves in the future. On the other hand, you've got to realize that the future should be discounted somewhat, because between now and the future, you may be eaten by a bear, right? Or by a big chicken, I guess is what you had. Well, if there had been people in New Zealand, there wouldn't have been any bears, but there would have been those big chickens to eat you. So anyway, I guess there were people along with the big chickens, weren't there? So I suppose they did worry about that. Some other issues which are, I think, nicely thought about in an evolutionary context are the conflict between parent and offspring, your genetic interests are not identical to those of your children, although they're similar. The conflict between siblings, again, siblings' genetic interests are not identical to each other, although they're similar. And, of course, the conflict between parents. Not that we know of anybody like that, but occasionally even the two parents in a family have conflicts of interest. Some of these, again, can be thought of in a useful way from an evolutionary standpoint. We won't have nearly enough time to discuss these matters. If you wanted a couple of very nice, I think a very nice reference to read by a biologist is Robert Triver's Social Evolution, which has a beautiful discussion, it seems to me, of the conflicts that one would expect between within families in all species, and has some nice empirical evidence about this. Actually, while mentioning references, another reference that I think is a useful one and an interesting one is a pair of books by two psychologists, Martin Daly and Margot Wilson. One is called Sex and Evolution, and the other is called Homicide. One of these books, well, these books are particularly interesting on the issue of the difference between the sexes, and a lot of interesting empirical work about measuring the difference in the behaviors of males and females. In the book called Homicide, you might be able to guess what the subject is, and guess who's doing all the killing. It's males, young males, I might add, so don't be afraid of me. More specifically, young males who don't have much wealth or don't have a mate are particularly likely to kill each other or to get killed or to get killed in accidents. The statistics are fantastic. You rarely see such significant differences as between males and females, classified by age, social status, all that stuff. Who's doing the killing? It's the males. And they argue that these guys are taking high-risk strategies according to their to maximize their reproductive potential. Could well be. Let's see. Anyway. So at this point, what I'd like to do is to shift to speak a little more specifically about some work I've done in one particular area of evolutionary economics. And it does have to do essentially with the problem of altruism versus selfishness. I'm going to start by thinking about the special case of relation between siblings in a sexual species, between brothers and sisters or brothers and brothers, to show you a little bit of the biology where the logic leads one, and then after that I want to talk a little bit about behavior that comes from what's sometimes called cultural evolution, where people adopt behaviors by copying other people. And I'm going to suggest that here too we get some interesting predictions about the amount of altruism that's going to emerge. Well, to set the stage, I want to present a little toy game that most of you are probably familiar with, called Prisoner's Dilemma. And the reason I want to do this is it seems like a nice laboratory for testing notions about cooperation and altruism, because it's a game in which people are strongly in conflict with each other. In a sense, I'll describe as follows. So the game has two players. We'll call them Ms. Blue and Mr. Red. And each of these players has two possible strategies. You can cooperate or you can defect. cooperate might be to mean to wash the dishes and clean the house, and defect might be to live like a pig, or you can think of whatever examples you like for cooperate and defect. Anyway, the way this little structure goes is the payoff, there'll be a payoff to each player, and the payoff you get depends on what you do and on what the other player does. Now, I've used letters for the payoffs because I'm going to play around with varying them a little bit. I'm going to have a payoff P, which we'll call, I'm borrowing the names for these payoffs, by the way, from Robert Axelrod, who wrote a book called something, The Evolution of Cooperation. If you both defect, okay, you're both going to get a payoff we'll call P, P for punishment. You both. If you both cooperate, you'll get a payoff called R, R for reward, and R is going to be bigger than P. Now, if Mr. Blue, this Blue, cooperates, and Mr. Red defects, she who cooperated will get 0, and he who defected will get T, which Axelrod calls the temptation. Okay. T is going to be the biggest you can get. It's really good to be a pig when your roommate cleans house, right? It's the nicest thing that can happen to you is you defect and the other player cooperates. The worst thing that can happen to you is you cooperate and the other player defects. Okay. So that's the way this setup is. And just to familiarize us with the diagram, down here we have, this is what happens. Blue defects, C, red cooperates, so blue gets T, the temptation, and red gets 0. So that describes what happens in each case. Now, what has fascinated social scientists about this game for a long time is the following fact. No matter what you think the other player is going to play in this game, you are better off defecting. Okay? Take a look. Suppose red is going to cooperate. Okay? If you defect, you'll get T, which is bigger than R. If red is going to defect, then blue would get P, which is bigger than 0. Whichever red is going to do, blue is better off defecting. Similarly, whatever blue is doing, red is better off defecting. So if each of them is pursuing its own self-interest, we will surely see them down here, with both of them defecting, both getting P. Which is puzzling to many people because we notice they'd both be better off if they both cooperated, right? So somehow rationality has led these people into a nasty trap. You get a worse outcome because they both understand what they're doing. In fact, this kind of experiment has been done many, many times in laboratories. What happens is that, for the most part, first of all, when people first play, many of them are confused. They don't play so intelligently. And many of them wind up doing cooperate. Many defect. As the researchers work more carefully, researchers then want to say, well, but I want to get these people to play what the game theory predicts. And so they work more carefully at giving people experience in playing the game, making sure that this is the true payoff and there's no hidden things going on later, trying various ways of framing the game. And as they frame it more and more carefully, they get closer and closer to the game theoretic prediction, but they don't get it. But it is not so easy. And they have to work. The particularly interesting thing, they have to work on framing the game. You know, if you get the game framed so the guy understands it well enough, you would think it's just, for example, I've for a long time thought there was no point in doing experiments because if the player understood this game, you'd say, well, would you rather have a kick in the butt or would you rather have a glass of cold beer? And so the answer's for any sane person. You'd simply declare the ones who got the answer wrong crazy and be done with it. But, or would you rather listen to the Dean for half an hour or have a nice beer? a little interesting there, I think, is that people, when you introspect about how you might play this game, well, when you first look at it, you haven't had it explained to you. You look at the rhetoric that surrounds it and the way it's framed, and you pick up cues about something in the rest of your life that, how do I behave normally in games that sound a little like that? Well, a lot of people say, well, I cooperate. Because they're bringing over baggage from games they play in other situations. Okay. So anyway, what we want to think about here is, can we think about some ways in which it would be sensible for players to cooperate in this game? Pretty clear it can't be sensible if the game is played one time and if the other player's strategy is independent of what you do. And that's the way the experimental design for this experiment is precisely that. But now we might ask ourselves some related questions. Suppose you were playing this game not in a way that, you didn't analyze this game and solve it with insight. Instead, you were wired to play it some way or another. Evolution selected you to play it one way or another. To make it to make the game particularly interesting, let's suppose that you're playing against your sibling, against your brother or sister. Okay. What would we expect? What kind of players would we expect natural selection to produce? Well, first of all, before we go to a full-blown model of sexual creatures, let's think about the way, I think this was the way I was taught up in Minnesota about how reproduction happened. Let's suppose that it was asexual, okay? And what I did, we weren't told at that time, of course, males would be a bloody nuisance in such an environment. So let's just imagine a model in which there's this asexual sorority. The sisters will play prisoner's dilemma against each other. The strategy they play will be inherited from their mother. They'll play whatever their mother did, except for the case of occasional mutants. Okay. Now, what I claim is that if this were the way a population reproduced, they would all cooperate in prisoner's dilemma. That would be the only equilibrium. How can I justify that? Well, first let's imagine a population that consists only of cooperators. Okay. Now, one day, one of these cooperators has a mutant baby who's a defector. Okay. She's a nasty little thing, and she defects against her sister. And she does great, in fact. She does better than anybody else than regular people, and she's fat and sassy. Her sister's pretty puny. But her good fortune isn't going to last, right? In future generations, she has 2 daughters. And by golly, they're both just like her, nasty little things. And they defect against each other and both get the payoff P. While the normal critters are having cooperator daughters who are nice to each other and both get R. The mutant line is going to be doing worse than the normals, and the mutant line is going to peter out. Okay. And because P is less than R. So in that situation, the cooperators could not be invaded by defectors. And in fact, if we want to think about it for 1 minute more, we can see that a population of defectors could be invaded by mutant cooperators. What would happen? Well, you'd have a defector, and one day one defector has a mutant baby cooperator, little Cinderella. And she's nice, you know. But her sister's nasty. Little Cinderella does very poorly. And the sister does very well, exploiting her nice sister. Now, a lot of this may have to happen several times with the little Cinderellas shriveling up, but one day one happens to meet a prince. No prince is involved here, I'm sorry. One of them happens to survive, and she has 2 babies, but they're both cooperators. They're both nice to each other. their babies are nice to each other. That line, her descendants, are going to all do better than the normals and eventually swamp that normal population. So what we've found, a little bit casually, but it holds up pretty simply, is that in an asexually reproducing population where the children are clones of their parents and inherit their strategies towards their siblings from their parents, you're going to see children that are perfect Kantians. That is, they choose the action that would be best for them if it would be copied by their sibling. Okay? In the case of Prisoner's Dilemma, Kantians play cooperate, thank you, because if you're going to be copied, then you better cooperate rather than defect. Now, some of you will have perhaps had real children, and you may have noticed that real children are not perfect Kantians with each other. Why? Well, think about the way you begat those children. You didn't beget them asexually, I hope. That being the case, the story is different. Basically, we can, in fact, there's some very interesting things we can do with more elaborate genetic models where we can talk about dominant and recessive genes, or we can do simple haploid genes. But let's in fact, because our time is short now, think about a very simple kind of genetics where what happens is that if you're a mutant, then with probability 1/2, your sibling is also a mutant, okay? The simplest version of that would be where, say, kind of simplified genetics where mom has one gene, pop has one gene. You either get mom's gene or you get pop's gene, or you just flip a coin. I get mom's or I get pop's. Okay, so then if pop happens to be a mutant and you got pop's, then there's a probability 1/2 that your sib got pop's as well. Actually, you'd find exactly the same calculus if you talked about a diploid species where the mutant was a dominant gene. For the moment, let's just look at this case. So, if you're a mutant, then the probability 1/2 is that your sibling is like you, right? Okay. Because how did your sibling get how he is? He inherited it from his parents. How did you get how you were? You inherited from your parents. Okay? So now something interesting happens. Okay. The technology of how you get to be the way you are doesn't allow you to change all by yourself, okay? There's a probability that your sibling is going to be changed in the same way. And for the particular game we're talking about, we'd ask, well, could a mutant, say, suppose we had a population of cooperators, could a mutant defector invade a population of cooperators? Well, maybe, maybe not, is the answer. Suppose everybody else is a cooperator, you're a mutant defector. With probability 1/2, your sib is also a defector, and you both get P, okay? With probability 1/2, your sib is an ordinary old cooperator, and you get to exploit your sib, and you get T. So your expected payoff is 1/2 P plus 1/2 T. Remember, we had this little, so what was it? Yeah, P is less than R is less than T. Okay, this inequality could go either way. If this is bigger, then the defector could invade. If not, the defector couldn't. Perhaps the surprise is that the no case can happen, because this means that it may be that a population of cooperative children is an equilibrium, an evolutionary equilibrium, even though the game played is one in which selfishness would have you play defect. On the other hand, it needn't be, as with the case of the asexuals, we knew for sure that defectors couldn't invade. We can ask a similar question about if we had a population of defectors, could it be invaded by a cooperator? And again, if everybody else is a defector, suppose you're a little mutant nice guy, okay? Probability 1/2, your sib is nice like you, and you both get R, which is better than the normals are getting. But with probability 1/2, your Sib's a stinker, just like ordinary people. He exploits you and you get zilch. And so, depending on, it may or may not be that cooperators can defect, again, depending on the size of these payoffs. We can draw a little diagram that tells this story. Essentially, this red line here is the line that makes this an equality. Above this line, let's see, cooperators can invade defectors. Okay. The other inequalities that we had were the conditions for can defectors invade cooperators. That's a different inequality. In fact, it's a half p, well, it's that. And the equals happens right on this blue line, not the red line, but a different blue line. Up in here, a defector cannot invade a cooperator, and a cooperator can invade defectors. So up in this region of parameters, the only equilibrium you'd see has everybody being a cooperator. Here we have a case where cooperators can't invade defectors and defectors can't invade cooperators, so there'd be two different equilibria. One in which everybody's nice, and another population in which everybody's nasty to his sibling. Both equilibria are possible. And so on. Down in here, we'd have, for these values, we'd have the only equilibria would be all defectors. And in here, there's no equilibrium no monomorphic equilibrium, that is none where everybody is at the same type. Okay, well, there's lots of things one can do with working more higher and deeper with this stuff, but I'm going to, let's see. I guess I'll remark then that the lesson I claim to extract from this little story is something like this. Sexual siblings are not Kantian, but they're not perfectly selfish either. They're semi-Kantian in the following sense. They act as they would. They act as if they had the following rule for themselves: act as you would in your own self-interest if you believed that with probability 1/2 your sibling would copy you. Okay, so you're thinking, well, should I suppose the population of cooperators? Should I defect? Should I cheat my sibling? Well, you say, well, I'll do it but I have to realize that the cost of doing it is that with probability 1/2, my sibling will be nasty too. But of course, the benefit is with probability 1/2, he won't. I can cheat him. Okay. Similarly, if everybody's defectors, should I be nice? Well, the benefit is with probability 1/2, my sibling will be nice too. But of course, he might not. Then I get screwed. Okay. So that's what the kind of genetics are going to tell us about what we would expect successful critters to do. I suppose I haven't been very explicit I should have said that more explicitly. In this little model, I'm thinking that these payoffs you get, okay, determine the probability that you survive to adulthood and get to reproduce yourself, okay. So the way that the name of the game here is you play this game with your relatives. If you get a good payoff, you're likely, the bigger the payoff you get in the game, the more likely you are to survive and make copies of yourself. And so we're seeing the successful genes making more copies of themselves. The successful genes, I'm arguing, will tend to make you act in this way with your sibs. All right. So I want to remark that what I was telling you was about the case of genetic copying. That's a very interesting story. But it's also true that much of how we behave is not genetically determined, but comes from copying in other ways, from copying the culture of the people around us, doing what successful people that we observe do, and so on. And this I claim is going to lead to a similar theory, because instead of having genetic siblings now, you talk about cultural siblings, people who have been exposed to pretty much the same environment you have, and people who are copying the same role models as you, because for the purpose of this model, what's a sibling? Somebody with the same parents as you, who's copying the same genes as you are copying. In cultural models, there'll be people or critters who are copying the same role models as you. So, in fact, I guess you don't even have to be the same species as someone with the same role model as you, I suppose. So I want to just talk quite quickly about what I think is quite a lovely model written by an anthropologist, Alan Rogers, about the economics of copying, of mimicking. And he has a very simple theory. He says, well, suppose there were two things you could do in deciding how to act. You could either do the research, figure out what's the right thing to do, or copy your neighbor. Okay. Which is the better thing to do? Well, if all your neighbors were doing the research themselves, if they were investigating themselves, copy one of your neighbors. I mean, why do the hard work yourself? Okay. But suppose that almost everybody is copying, and only a couple of guys are doing the research. Okay. Then you're going to be copying very likely you're copying a copy of a copy of a copy, a very old copy of something that where the information may well be garbled by now. You've got a bad copy of the original choice of action, or the research was done a long time ago, it's old-fashioned, it's wrong. If there's not much research going on, it may well pay you to investigate and do it yourself. This leads to a little diagram like this, where on this axis we have the percent who are copying. Here we have the payoff to the guy who copies. Here we have the payoff to the researcher. These cross at some point where it's equally good to do either. And Rogers' suggestion is the population will have a mixture of copiers and independent discoverers who, and they'll be equally well off for the reason he suggests. Well, that leads to a very nice model of how you should behave if you, in a number of ways. First of all, what we would expect to happen to rules that are copied by cultural siblings. Another thing, a more cold-blooded view, would be, suppose you did research and you figured out the action you're going to take, but you realized that half of your colleagues are going to copy your action, okay? And you have to say, well, I'm not taking this action independently. It's going to be copied by my colleagues. So you make fun of Keynesians or whatever, and half your colleagues make fun of Keynesians. Then it's not so much fun to make fun of Keynesians if you're not. So it goes. Anyway, I claim that the mathematics is rather like the mathematics of sibling relationships, and will lead to some consequences, some extra support for altruism. Finally, I'm going to leave you with one last example. I'm just going to tell you how it goes, and you can play with it on your own if you like. This is something I call the Lake Woebegone Carousel. The story is this. It's a bunch of farmers who live on the edge of a lake, Lake Woebegone, and each farmer interacts with his two neighbors. In fact, he plays a game of prisoner's dilemma with each of his two neighbors. And his payoff is the sum of the payoff that he gets from the neighbor on his left and the neighbor on his right. Okay. So, for example, here I've got a configuration of how these guys might be behaving, and we could just read off. You know, this guy has two cooperative neighbors. He's defected. He does great. He gets 2T, and so on. Okay. Now, these farmers are being observed by their young sons. In fact, the young son sees what Dad did, sees what the two neighbors did, and one rule we can have is the young son chooses the action of the most successful farmer he observes. Okay, he sees 3 farmers. He cooperates. He chooses the action of the most successful guy he observes. In that game, what would happen, it'll turn out, I mean, this is a game you can play with paper and pencil yourself, actually. The kind of interesting case is up in the region where cooperate would have been the equilibrium between siblings. Any first of all, any block, any arrangement where you had blocks, where all the C's were in clusters of 3 and more, and all the D's were in clusters of 2 or more, turns out to be a stable equilibrium. So you could sustain some cooperation or some defection in that situation. But if you want to see something really cute happen, change the rules a little bit. Make it more realistic. Suppose the kid pays no attention to what happened to his old man. I mean, why? Nobody pays any attention to his father. He only observes the 2 neighbors on each side. And he copies the more successful of his father's 2 neighbors. Okay. If that happens, then we can construct very curious little things happen. We can construct a little pattern of C's and D's that gets up and walks around the lake, essentially. It's like, if you've seen the game of life, it's like a glider. In particular, what would happen if you have a pattern of a C, then a D, and then 3 C's, you would find that in each generation, each of these guys will copy the person on his left, I believe, and this little pattern, so here's a pattern like this pattern would move. It would be as if this pattern picked up, moved there, and the next round, next generation it moved there, next generation. Okay. So, I could defect, of course. So in fact, if you sat at one of these locations, you would see, if a historian who sat at one location would see alternating cycles of cooperate and defect on the same farm. A few generations of cooperate, then a few generations of defect. Somebody watching from above would see this figure moving around. The point is, that's not the only thing that could happen. Many other things could happen, but the dynamics of copying lead to rather a different story than one would have expected from the static look at Prisoner's Dilemma.